His grandmother was never the kind of woman who told stories to be noticed. She lived quietly, spoke carefully, and never wasted words. Most of her life had been spent near the edge of the forest, back when people relied more on the land than on explanations. As a child, he remembered sitting near her chair, listening to the steady ticking of the old clock, watching her gaze out the window toward the trees. There was always something heavy in her eyes, something unfinished. One evening, many years later, when her voice had grown softer and her hands trembled slightly, she finally spoke. "There's something I never told anyone," she said. He smiled politely, expecting an old memory, maybe regret, maybe a family secret. What he didn't expect was what followed. "I met someone in the woods," she continued. "Not a person. A female. But not human." He almost laughed. Stories about Bigfoot belonged on late-night radio, not in his grandmother's living room. He had heard enough myths to dismiss it, but she didn't sound confused. She didn't sound afraid. She sounded certain. She described the forest exactly as it had been that day, the light filtering through the trees, the smell of damp earth, the unnatural quiet. Then she described the figure, tall, injured, unmistakably female, and the eyes that looked back at her, not wild, not violent, just tired. As she spoke, her voice broke, not from fear, but from something closer to sorrow. That was when he understood this wasn't a story meant to impress. It was a memory she had carried alone for decades. His grandmother had always been a woman of quiet strength. She rarely raised her voice and never sought attention. Every word she spoke seemed measured, deliberate, carrying a weight that made listeners pause and listen. Those who knew her well understood that her silence was not emptiness. It was a choice, a shield, and a reflection of a life lived with purpose. She had spent most of her years near the edge of the forest, in a small, weathered home where the trees were both neighbors and guardians. Life there was simple but demanding. She rose early each morning to tend to chores that others might have found tedious: gathering wood, fetching water, preparing meals, and maintaining the small garden that provided fresh vegetables through every season. Her hands were strong from labor, yet gentle when needed, and there was a rhythm to her day that seemed to mirror the quiet pulse of the forest itself. Those who visited often noted the stillness that clung to her. She could sit for hours, gazing out at the trees without speaking, as if listening to some secret that the world had forgotten. Her silence was not loneliness, it was resilience. She had learned to move through life carefully, observing, understanding, and protecting herself from unnecessary complications. Yet, for those paying attention, subtle signs hinted at something deeper. A pause before she answered certain questions. A distant look in her eyes when she spoke of the forest. A faint tightening of her lips when a particular memory surfaced. These small, almost imperceptible gestures suggested that her past held stories and experiences that had shaped her, profoundly, moments that had left marks on her spirit. Even if she carried them quietly, in every gesture, every measured word, there was a sense that her life had been lived with care, and that behind her calm exterior lay truths known only to her. It was one of those quiet evenings when the house seemed to hold its breath. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting a warm, flickering light across the room. Outside, the forest loomed dark and still, its edges blurred by the shadows of twilight. He sat nearby, feeling the familiar comfort of his grandmother's presence, yet aware of a tension that had never been named. For years, she had remained silent about her past. She rarely spoke of her younger days, the forest, or the experiences that had shaped her. When asked, she would offer only brief, practical answers, leaving the rest to the imagination. But tonight was different. Something in the air suggested that she was ready to share a story she had carried alone for decades. Her voice, soft and unsteady at first, broke the usual calm. "There's something I never told anyone," she said. He looked up, surprised. A polite smile crossed his face, expecting perhaps a family memory or a minor regret. Maybe a story of youth, long forgotten. But the seriousness in her eyes made him pause. There was no playfulness here, no exaggeration, no hint of jest. She was speaking with intention, with the weight of someone who had held a truth too long to carry alone. "I met someone in the woods," she continued. "Not a person. A female. But not human." He blinked, unsure whether to laugh or remain quiet. Stories of creatures like Bigfoot belonged in myths and late-night tales, not in his grandmother's small familiar living room. Yet her expression left no room for doubt. She was calm, certain, and beneath the certainty, there was something else, a sorrow. A quiet gravity that made the room feel heavier than it had moments before. The firelight flickered across her face, highlighting the lines of a life well lived, but also the depth of experiences never shared. For the first time, he realized that this story was not meant for amusement. It was a truth she had borne silently, a fragment of a life lived alongside something extraordinary. Known only to her and the forest she had called home, her memories of the forest were vivid, painted with the clarity of someone who had spent countless hours among its trees. In her younger years, she had walked its trails regularly, sometimes for errands, sometimes for solitude. The forest was both a companion and a challenge, a place where life moved at its own pace, indifferent to human concerns. The trees stood tall and silent, their roots tangled beneath the earth, and their leaves whispered secrets when the wind passed through. The air carried the scent of moss, damp soil, and pine, grounding her in a world untouched by the bustle of towns and roads. She remembered the quiet mornings best. Sunlight would spill through the canopy, scattering golden patterns on the forest floor. Birds would stir gently, their calls punctuating the stillness. Every step she took required careful attention. Roots could trip the unwary. Stones could shift beneath her boots. But she learned to move with purpose and awareness. The forest demanded respect, and she had given it freely, learning its rhythms and understanding its moods. On the day of the encounter, she had been alone, walking the familiar path near a small creek. The forest was unusually silent. No birds sang, no wind rustled the branches. The stillness pressed against her senses, and a small unease crept in, though she could not explain why. She trusted the forest. She had lived with it, known it intimately. Yet, that day, it felt different, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something. Her years of experience taught her caution, but also patience. She could sense life in its subtle forms, the rustle of a small animal, the snap of a twig underfoot, the shift of shadows along the trees. Every detail mattered. Every sound or lack of sound carried meaning. That attention to the smallest nuances would prove essential, she would later recall. When she came face to face with something entirely unexpected, the forest had been her refuge, her teacher, and on that day, it became the setting for a memory she would carry for the rest of her life, one that would remain secret for decades. Held quietly in the depth of her heart, she saw it first as a movement at the edge of the trees, a shape that did not belong to any ordinary animal she had encountered. At a distance, it stood tall and upright, its posture strangely familiar, yet undeniably different. Her heart quickened, not with panic, but with a cautious curiosity. Years of walking the forest had taught her to observe first, to understand before reacting, and now every instinct she had honed came alive. The figure was unmistakably female. Even from where she stood, she could see the curve of the shoulders, the proportion of the limbs, the gentle sway as it shifted its weight. Its fur was dark, mottled with streaks of lighter brown that caught the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. Though large, it moved with a surprising grace, its steps deliberate and quiet on the forest floor. She froze, unsure whether to retreat or approach, every sense alert. Her eyes met its own, and for a moment, time seemed to hold still. There was intelligence there, awareness, and a calm recognition that went beyond simple fear or curiosity. It was not aggressive. It was cautious, aware of her presence, yet not threatened by it. For a long moment, they simply watched each other. She noticed the way its shoulders slumped slightly, the careful way it shifted its weight, the fatigue that seemed to emanate from its every movement. It was clear it had been through something exhausting. Her heart ached for it before she even fully understood why. Then came the subtle realization. This was not a creature to fear. There was something deeply human in its sorrow, something maternal in its posture, something that spoke of endurance and pain. Despite its size and unfamiliarity, she felt a strange connection, an unspoken understanding that neither needed words. It was the first time she truly recognized that not all that is unknown is dangerous. Some things, even the most unusual, may simply be lost, hurt, or misunderstood. And in that quiet clearing, the first thread of trust began to form between them, fragile but undeniable, setting the stage for what was to come. She could see it clearly now. The female figure was not just unusual in size and shape, it bore signs of struggle. A long, shallow cut ran along her forearm, dirt and dried blood mixing in a stark, unsettling contrast against her fur. Her leg bore bruises that darkened the softer patches of skin underneath, evidence of a fall or a collision. She moved slowly, favoring one side, as if each step demanded careful calculation. Her breathing was heavy, measured as if every inhale carried the weight of fatigue. She was exhausted, physically and perhaps emotionally, and yet she held herself upright, unwilling to collapse despite the obvious pain. The forest, usually a place of strength and refuge, now seemed to press closer, as if even the trees were bearing witness to her struggle. Grandmother's heart tightened. She had seen injury before, animals, people, but this felt different. There was no malice in the figure, no trace of aggression or threat. Only vulnerability. And in that vulnerability, a quiet dignity emerged. She moved with care, alert to every subtle motion, signaling both caution and resilience. For a moment, she thought of turning back. Perhaps this was too strange, too dangerous. But the look in the female's eyes stopped her. They were tired, yes, but not wild. They held intelligence, recognition, and an almost human patience. She could sense a silent plea, not for dominance, not for challenge, but for understanding. For a simple acknowledgement that she was not alone. Grandmother stepped closer. Carefully, slowly, her hands outstretched in a gesture of reassurance rather than touch. The creature did not flinch. She noticed the tension in her shoulders, the subtle hesitation before each movement. The way she weighed every action as if the world itself might tip with a wrong step. It was clear that help, however minimal, was welcome. And in that moment, Grandmother realized the truth. This was not an encounter to fear. It was an encounter to witness, to respect, and if possible, to aid. That understanding, quiet and deliberate, would guide her actions in the moments to follow, shaping a bond neither had anticipated. For a long moment, neither moved. The forest around them seemed to fade, reduced to the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. All that mattered was the quiet understanding forming between Grandmother and the female figure before her. They stood in that clearing, separated by only a few steps, yet connected by something far more profound than proximity. Their eyes met, and in that gaze, a language unspoken passed between them. The female's eyes were large, deep, and reflective, filled with weariness and a hint of fear, but also a strange intelligence. She did not look at Grandmother with hostility. She looked with acknowledgement, as if recognizing someone who might see her not as a monster, but as a being in need. Grandmother felt a shiver of empathy. There was no need for words. The creature communicated through stillness, through subtle gestures. A slight tilt of the head, the careful way she shifted her weight, the brief pause before stepping forward, all of it spoke volumes. She was cautious, aware, and fragile, yet she exuded an undeniable dignity. Grandmother held her ground, letting her presence be gentle but firm, a silent promise that she meant no harm. She could feel the tension in the air, the delicate balance of trust being tested with each passing second. And in return, the female's posture softened slightly. The shoulders, once rigid, relaxed just a fraction. The hands, once clenched, eased into a position of rest. It was a moment of connection that transcended species, a mutual recognition of vulnerability and endurance. Grandmother realized that fear had no place here, not when faced with such quiet suffering, such resilient spirit. She saw the exhaustion etched in every line of the creature's body, the careful deliberation in her movements, and the unspoken plea for understanding. And for the first time, Grandmother felt the weight of responsibility, not just for her own safety, but for this being standing before her. So unlike anything she had ever known, yet profoundly relatable. In that shared gaze, a bridge formed, fragile but unmistakable, setting the stage for a choice that would define the rest of that encounter. Grandmother's mind raced, though her body remained still. She had never been one to act without thought. Yet every instinct she had cultivated over decades whispered the same thing. This being needed help. She could see it in the careful way the female shifted her weight, the slight wince as she tried to adjust her stance, the exhaustion that seemed to weigh her down like a heavy cloak. She paused, considering the risks. She had lived long enough to understand the dangers of the forest, the unpredictability of wild creatures. Any wrong move could provoke fear, anger, or flight. And yet, the decision was clear. Standing by and doing nothing felt impossible. She had seen enough suffering in her lifetime to know that compassion, however small, could make a difference. Carefully, she stepped forward, slow and deliberate, allowing the female to see her every movement. Her hands remained open, palms facing upward in a gesture of reassurance. She did not rush. She gave space for the creature to decide, to accept or refuse. The forest held its quiet breath as though it, too, understood the significance of this moment. The female flinched slightly at the first movement, but did not retreat. She seemed to weigh the intention in Grandmother's approach, recognizing that help carried no threat. Each step Grandmother took was measured, guided by a mixture of instinct and empathy, a desire to ease the pain she saw before her without imposing herself. When she reached out, it was not to grab, not to force, but simply to offer support. A gentle touch to the arm, careful and deliberate, a silent assurance that she was not alone. The creature's eyes softened, a subtle exhale escaping, as though the tension that had held her upright began to ease, even if only slightly. In that quiet exchange, Grandmother understood something essential. Help was not always about grand gestures or certainty. Sometimes it was the courage to stand still, to offer presence, and to extend a hand when the world seemed heavy. She felt a strange kinship, a connection born not from words, but from shared recognition of vulnerability and resilience. And as the forest held them in its calm embrace, Grandmother made the choice that would define the rest of that encounter. She would help, as best she could, without fear, without expectation, simply because it was the right thing to do. As Grandmother stayed close, the female figure's posture shifted subtly. She did not retreat or show aggression. Instead, there was a quiet protectiveness in the way she held herself, a vigilance that seemed both natural and instinctive. Her movements were deliberate, measured, as if every action was guided by an innate understanding of the fragility of her surroundings, and now, of the presence beside her. Grandmother noticed it in the way the creature's eyes lingered, the slight curling of her fingers, the careful placement of each foot. There was a rhythm to her gestures, almost maternal, as though she had carried responsibilities long before Grandmother arrived. It was not an expression of dominance or power, but a quiet assertion of care, of awareness. of survival intertwined with compassion. The forest seemed to recognize this exchange, the soft rustle of leaves echoing the calm tension in the clearing. Grandmother felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. Here was a being so different from herself, yet she could feel its fatigue, its pain, its need for understanding. And in return, she offered patience, gentleness, and the presence of another who could witness without judgment. There was a moment when the creature glanced away, then back, as if assessing the intentions of this human who had dared to approach without fear. Grandmother understood that trust was being measured, step by step, through subtle cues and quiet observation. No words were necessary. The language of attention, of steady eyes and gentle gestures, was enough. In that stillness, Grandmother realized the depth of what she was witnessing. This female figure was more than injured. She was a mother, a protector, a living testament to endurance in a world that often demanded too much. There was sorrow in her eyes, yes, but also a resilience that commanded respect. An almost sacred dignity that required no explanation. And for the first time, Grandmother felt not fear, but a profound sense of reverence. She recognized that compassion could bridge the divide between species, that quiet care could speak louder than words. In that maternal presence, she saw not a creature to be feared, but a life to honor, a bond forming in the quiet space between understanding and trust. The moment came without warning, though it had been quietly approaching all along. The female figure shifted her weight, her movements deliberate yet slower than before. Grandmother sensed that it was time, that their encounter, profound as it had been, was nearing its natural conclusion. The forest, which had seemed suspended in stillness, began to breathe with the soft sounds of life returning. A bird calling in the distance, the gentle rustle of leaves stirred by a passing breeze. The creature's eyes met Grandmother's one last time. There was a depth there that spoke of understanding and gratitude, a recognition of the quiet courage that had brought them together. No words were exchanged, none were needed, but in that look, a story was told. A story of endurance, of pain, of trust earned in the span of a single fragile encounter. She took a small step back, as if to signal that the time had come to part ways. Grandmother remained still, allowing her the space to move freely, to reclaim the forest that had always been her home. The creature hesitated briefly, glancing once more toward the human who had dared to approach without fear, then turned with deliberate grace and began to move back into the shadows of the trees. Grandmother watched, her heart heavy yet calm. There was no fear in the creature's retreat, no trace of aggression or resentment. Only quiet resolve, the same dignity she had displayed from the moment they had met. Each step carried the weight of exhaustion and survival, a rhythm as old as the forest itself. As the female figure disappeared from view, the forest seemed to exhale. Grandmother remained where she was, standing in the clearing, feeling the echo of the encounter in her chest. She understood, more deeply than she could have anticipated, that some moments are fleeting yet everlasting. Though the creature was gone, her presence lingered imprinted in the stillness of the trees, the soft hum of the forest, and in the memory of a human who had been privileged to witness a quiet, extraordinary life. The separation was complete, yet the bond remained, fragile but indelible, etched into the quiet corners of Grandmother's heart. After that day in the forest, Grandmother returned to her life with the quiet dignity she had always carried. No one ever knew what she had seen. She spoke to no one of the tall, injured female figure whose eyes had mirrored her own understanding. The secret remained hers, tucked away like a fragile treasure, carried silently through the years. Her days continued as before, routine and deliberate. She rose early, tended to her chores, and moved through the familiar rhythms of home and forest. Yet beneath that steady exterior lay a memory that shaped her in ways few could comprehend. It influenced the way she walked among the trees, the way she paused to notice subtle signs of life, the patience and care she extended to all living beings. Though the encounter had been brief, its impact was profound. She had seen vulnerability and strength intertwined, witnessed intelligence and maternal instinct in a being so unlike any human she had known. And she had understood the power of compassion, of quiet aid offered without expectation. The forest itself seemed to carry the weight of that understanding. Holding the memory as carefully as she did, she never shared the story, not out of fear, but out of respect for the creature, for the forest, and for the delicate trust that had existed between them. She knew that some truths are meant to live quietly in the mind and heart, rather than on lips or in conversation. Some moments are too pure, too intimate, to be reduced to words or disbelief. Grandmother carried her secret with grace, the memory becoming a part of her. When she walked along the forest edge, she sometimes felt a presence, a quiet acknowledgement of the encounter that had changed her. It reminded her that extraordinary experiences do not always demand recognition. They demand understanding, patience, and a steady heart. In this way, her secret remained safe, shaping her life silently, guiding her actions, and leaving behind a subtle but enduring imprint on the person she had become. It was a lifetime's quiet truth, a story lived fully, yet shared with no one, preserved in the calm spaces between memory and experience. Over the years, he had often dismissed his grandmother's stories as the quiet musings of age, gentle exaggerations meant to entertain or reflect on a life long lived. Yet, as he listened to her recount that day in the forest, he began to notice the details she included, details no ordinary story would contain. The rust of the leaves, the angle of sunlight filtering through the trees, the way the creature moved and held herself, all were precise, careful, and consistent. It was the certainty in her voice that unsettled him. Not a single word wavered in doubt. She did not embellish, she did not dramatize. She simply spoke, and in the calmness of her recollection, he felt the weight of her truth. Every pause, every deliberate choice of words, carried the resonance of someone who had lived this memory alone, quietly, and faithfully. He began to recall the subtle hints she had dropped over the years, those moments when she seemed lost in thought, her gaze lingering on the edge of the forest as if expecting to see something familiar. He remembered the stories of the forest's quiet sounds, the careful attention she paid to every small sign of life, the patient way she moved through it all. Those were not the habits of someone who fabricated tales for amusement. They were the behaviors of someone who had witnessed something extraordinary and had integrated that understanding into her way of living. The more he listened, the more he realized that belief was no longer optional. He could no longer dismiss the sincerity and precision with which she spoke. The story she carried was not about proving the impossible. It was about remembering, honoring, and sharing a quiet truth that had shaped a lifetime. And so, slowly, carefully, he began to believe. Not because of proof, not because of others' opinions, but because he had come to understand the depth of her experience. In her calm and measured words, he saw a reality that transcended fear, myth, or skepticism, a reality grounded in compassion, observation, and the quiet, enduring bond between human and the extraordinary. After her passing, he returned to the forest that had been such an integral part of her life. The small paths she had walked, the creek where she had paused to rest, the quiet clearings she had loved, they all seemed imbued with her presence. The forest no longer felt like a distant backdrop to her memories. It had become a living testament to the woman she had been, and the experiences she had carried silently. He walked slowly, remembering the stories she had never told aloud, the eyes she had described, the figure she had seen. Each step through the trees brought both grief and comfort. Grief for her absence, but comfort in the knowledge that she had lived with integrity, courage, and compassion. The memory of the female figure in the forest remained vivid. No longer a tale, but a truth he had begun to understand. He felt a quiet connection, not only to his grandmother, but to the life she had witnessed, the bond she had formed with something extraordinary. In the stillness of the woods, he realized that some truths do not need to be spoken to be known. They live in memory, in respect, and in the quiet spaces left behind by those who carry them. He often reflected on the stories his grandmother had shared, not as tales to be proven, but as lessons in compassion and understanding. The encounter she had described, the quiet bond she had formed with the female figure in the forest, had left an indelible mark on her life and through her. On his own, he realized that the forest, with all its stillness and mystery, was more than a collection of trees and wildlife. It was a place where moments of quiet connection could occur, moments that asked nothing of a person except attention, patience, and respect. The figure his grandmother had encountered was not a creature to fear, but a life to honor, a presence that carried its own story of endurance and care. Some truths, he understood, do not demand belief. They do not require proof, argument, or acceptance from others. They exist quietly, waiting for those willing to observe, to feel, and to respect the world as it is. His grandmother had carried that truth for decades, and in doing so, she had taught him more than any storybook or lesson ever could. And so, he held the memory gently, honoring the life of the woman who had raised him, and the life she had quietly protected in the depths of the forest. Some truths, he understood, are not told to convince. They are lived silently, respectfully, and forever remembered.